Hi, good afternoon. I'm Mike Duran from the Hudson Institute, and this is an event on assessing the impact of President Trump's maximum pressure campaign on Iran. And joining me today is my Hudson colleague, senior fellow David Asher, and Scott Modell. He's the president of the Rapidan Energy Group, and he's a former senior CIA Iran operations officer. And last but not least, we have Mohsen Sazagara. He's the president of the Iran Research Institute, and he's one of the most prominent dissidents, Iranian dissidents living in America today. Mohsen, I'll turn to you first, if you don't mind. But before I do, if memory serves, you were actually a personal associate of the Ayatollah Khomeini, were you not? If I remember correctly, I think you were on the famous victory flight from France to Iran.
Yes, Mike. I joined Ayatollah Khomeini from United States. I was studying at Chicago, Illinois, on 1978, and the revolution started because I was a member of liberation movement of Iran abroad in those days. And Dr. Yazdi, the top advisor to Ayatollah Khomeini, was one of the leaders of liberation movement of Iran. He called me and said that we need you, Mohsen. So I joined him, and all that 3.5 months, I was in Notre Chateau, and I returned to Iran with the same flight.
Oh, you're the only person I've ever met who knew the Ayatollah Khomeini personally. I can't think of anybody better to give us an assessment of the state of play of the Islamic Republic today. By all appearances, the Islamic Republic is in a severe political crisis, political and economic crisis. Could you give us your assessment of what's going on?
Yeah, after 41 years of Islamic Republic of Iran, bunch of problems. I have to say, in every aspect, political, social, cultural, and especially economic problems are now accumulated in Iran. From economy point of view, I have to say that the mismanagement, wrong way, state-run economy, which produced corruption in Iran, deep corruption everywhere. It starts from the leader Ayatollah Khamenei himself and goes to every part of the economy of the country. After the maximum pressure from this administration, I have to say that the cancer of economy in Iran became more painful. The main problem of economy of Iran is its structure, the state-run, and corruption inside that. But the sanctions showed these problems and troubles much more than before and made it more painful for the economy of the country. And after coronavirus, the corona impact was huge in Iran because now mismanagement of this regime, many mistakes showed that this regime is nothing but a propaganda machine and a suppression machine. None of the other functions of a regime works in Iran, including the health ministry and other ministries, the government or Revolutionary Guard or the leader himself. For this reason, there is a mess now. For instance, the Ministry of Health announced that the total infected people are about 95 to close to 100,000. But the medical system of Iran, the doctors that collect the statistics and sum it up, they say that they believe that estimation is more than 1.5 million people all around the country. The death toll, regime hides and says that it's about 6,000, a little bit more, but the real death toll is more than 50,000. And because of this problem, now in every part of the society, not only the economy like the other countries in the world have been affected by this new situation, but for instance, the security forces. Police says that now they are in short of personnel in police stations, especially in the small towns. Or Basij, one of the militia of Revolutionary Guard, have been reduced to half. Or inside IRGC, Revolutionary Guard, there are many sick leaves. Or in Artesh, the classic military of Iran. I mean, the first impact, I can say that has been in the machine of suppression of the regime too. And on the other parts of the society, for instance, the Ministry of Agriculture says that 30% of the lands, although spring has started, has not been cultivated, and there is now the fear of shortages of food in the country, or in industries of Iran, or small businesses. I mean, every part of the society uh, 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 is now affected by this crisis, and the weakness of the regime, misfunction of this regime has been appeared during this crisis. As you know, last November, we had uprising in more than 220 cities of Iran. Average 1,000 people came to street. They were poor people. After increasing of the price of the gas, there were protests all around the country in 220 cities, out of more than 400 cities of Iran. But it was crushed by the regime very brutally. At least 1,500 people were killed. But now those people, those poor people that are totally 22 million population of Iran out of 84 million population, they are more hungry, and now the fear of the illness has been added to that. And not only I say, as a politician or observer from outside Iran, I have seen the reports from inside the regime, from Ministry of Intelligence of Iran, that they say that uh, they uh, they think that the crisis is on the way, much bigger than last November, and protests will go all around the country. Uh, I can say that to to sum up what I say, I can say that now we have a regime that can't solve the problems of the people, not only in Corona crisis but in other aspects. Does not have any legitimacy for the people, and Iran is going gradually toward a situation in third and fourth quarter of this year that I can say that there will be a fourth way. One way, which I estimate is about 30% chance of this first way, is collapse of the regime. Because right now there are many unrests, not only in the society, but inside the regime as well. And the second option will be crisis after crisis, riots after riots, and somehow endless crisis all around the country. This is the a picture for the future, near future of Iran in next few months.
Before I move on to Scott, I wonder if I could just follow up on one thing you said. I thought the most interesting detail that you noted were, as you're seeing it, cracks inside the regime. Because as an observer from the outside, I've been looking to see if there's disagreement among regime loyalists, and serious disagreement and real fragmentation and conflict between them. And so far, I, as a distant observer, haven't seen anything like that. But you're suggesting it's there or almost there. Could you go into a little bit more detail about that?
Yeah, Mike, as you know, I was one of the founders of Revolutionary Guard for first few months of Victory of Revolution, and one of the writers of the Charter of Revolutionary Guard on those days. But although I was not with the Guard anymore, but still I have good friends that amongst them, and I received some information from them. For instance, the Revolutionary Guard people, which are actually the backbone of keeping this regime, the main pillar of suppression machine of the regime. Now I hear some critics from not only the mid-level of IRGC, but top levels. Top levels, they criticize their leader himself, Velayat Faqih. And
Sorry,
sometimes
sorry to interrupt. They criticize quietly or in public?
not in public yet, quietly, but this is something that the intelligence of the regime has heard that, and they worry about that because some top generals, the mid-management of IRGC are dissatisfied, definitely like the other people of Iran. But even amongst the top commanders, you hear sometimes in private circles that they criticize the leader and say that this guy is crazy and is going to lose not only the power but the whole, all of us and all the country. Amongst the body of the Revolutionary Guard, like the body of the society, 90% they are dissatisfied, and they criticize the situation, the regime, the government, and everything which is going on.
What do they want? What do they think the supreme leader should be doing that he's not doing? What's the substance of their criticism?
For instance, one of the demands of the society and the people in the regime is that Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader, has owned about 50% of the economy of the country. He has the main sources of money, the biggest petrochemical companies, at least 4 big banks, lots of the properties of the country, more than 50,000 of them. In electronics, many factories, many oil projects. So totally about 50% of GDP of the economy of Iran is controlled by the companies and institutions which are under command and owned by the leader. Now there is a big demand in the society that why don't the leader, why doesn't he give the money to the government to give it to the people to they can sit down at home and don't come out of the house, get corona and die. But he doesn't do that.
So let me just sum up what you just said, and you tell me if I got it correct. The general populist critique of the regime as out of touch and corrupt, feathering its own nest, is shared not just by people on the street, but actually within the elite itself and the most loyal elements of the regime.
Yeah, exactly.
Fascinating. Well, Scott, let's move to you as a veteran of the competition, the struggle against the Islamic Republic. When you hear Mohsen present that kind of analysis, what opportunities for the United States or challenges for the United States do you perceive?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And Mohsen, I appreciate your comments. You know, I think as someone who's been watching this for a long time, I think there's a couple of things we need to think about. Let's start with maximum pressure. We're approaching the 2-year anniversary of the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign on Iran. So when you hear Mohsen describe this current state of play in Iran, it resonates with anybody who's been watching Iran for a very long time, in the sense that a lot of the dysfunctionality is caused by Iranians themselves. The regime has brought most of these crises on themselves: social, political, economic. And the way Mohsen describes it is that we've reached a point where it's at a low point of credibility and legitimacy. So I ask myself, is the United States now in a position to take advantage of maximum pressure and go the extra mile, and to do what a lot of us have wanted to do for a long time, and which is basically to sort of brush this regime into the dustbin of history and move on? And I think maximum pressure had that idea in mind. But taking a step back, maximum pressure and the way that President Trump, Secretary Pompeo, and the entire administration has framed it from day one has not been about explicit regime change, or implicit for that matter. It's been about changing the regime's behaviors. And they've laid out, Secretary Pompeo came out with his famous 12 demands, the behaviors that they want changed. So you have to ask yourself, when I ask myself, maximum pressure that is directed for the purpose of changing this behavior, is it successful or has it been a failure? Well, thus far, aside from revealing the dysfunctionality inside of Iran the way that Mohsen talked about it, in terms of just looking at the 12 key behaviors, from sponsoring Hezbollah, sponsoring Shia militia groups in Iraq, human rights abuses, not recognizing the right of Israel to exist, and so on, the regime's behavior hasn't changed at all. So I would say, if the goal has been to change Iranian behavior, maximum pressure has not worked yet. But you're getting to your question, is there a unique time here to build on maximum pressure to make it work? And I would say that the most important thing for me is, if we really want to change Iran's malign behavior in the region, you're going to have to do much more than we're doing. Sanctions, I think what we've seen is sanctions alone are not going to be nearly enough to change the regime, or even to end the violence for that matter. If we are going to stick to the goal of changing their behavior, then I think, and people don't like to discuss it, but covert action, and I'm talking about sort of a kinder, gentler 21st century version of covert action, is necessary. Now, when I say covert action, I'm talking about actions that we can do that lie somewhere in between traditional diplomacy and war. We all know in this environment, the American public or politicians are not going to support a military invasion of Iran, and that's not what I'm suggesting. But when we're looking at ways of strengthening maximum pressure to potentially move beyond this regime once and for all, if it is as brittle as Mohsen has described it, then I think a new version of covert action has to be thought of. Things that are compatible with the American values of 2020, if you're going to come up with a new, kinder, gentler version of covert action, you're talking about training, you're talking about more media, you're talking about how to build a nonviolent civil resistance movement. Some of these things Mohsen and other dissidents are already engaged in. But if the US government really wanted to help Iranians who have been seeking freedom help themselves, how to unify, how to organize, how to mass mobilize and create a resistance movement that can be resilient enough to get beyond sporadic one-off protests, even though those protests can be quite large and scary for the regime at times, how do we get to a place where they can affect political change? I think we're going to have a serious debate in this country about what that means.
Well, let me push back on that a little bit, Scott. You yourself said that there's a reluctance in the administration to adopt a regime change position. I would say myself, I think it goes way beyond the administration. I think it's a real reluctance in the country, and on the left and the right. I personally one of the lessons that I learned from the election of Donald Trump is the fatigue, I think, that the American people have with covert action in the Middle East. Not just covert action, but action in the Middle East. A sense that we don't really, as the president himself has said, we don't really understand the region very well. We carry out these big muscle movements, which have all kinds of long-term implications that we didn't foresee, and that really the wiser course is to go for behavior change of the regime. And if Mohsen is correct, I mean, yes, the malign behaviors of Iran that we want to change have not changed, but they are clearly under an extent, a degree of pressure that they've never been under before, having to make very, very significant decisions about where to put their resources. And I would say that the chances of getting the kind of behavior change that we seek are probably better now than ever before. How would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I would totally agree with you. I'm saying if we decide that we want to maintain the current goals as the Trump administration has defined them, those 12 demands are all about very, very fundamental behaviors that the Iranians are very unlikely to change. What Mohsen, I think, is referring to are the regime is under greater pressure than it has been, arguably in 40 years, with maybe a few exceptions. But what I would say to you is that it's been under pressure before. The danger is that the Iranians decide, in the interest of our own survival, we'll enter into negotiations with the Trump administration. The Iranians have been very clear in understanding maximum pressure is not all that bad, because at the end of the day, Trump continues to talk about, and he tweeted this a couple of weeks ago, how we've spent $8 trillion and counting in wars in the Middle East, and all we've gotten, in his words, are death and cost. He talks about talks about wanting to fight his way out of the Middle East, not in. So, I think the Iranians are looking at this and they're saying at some point we're going to have the ability to do a JCPOA plus, that Trump can call a new deal, and then so that Trump can do what he really wants to do, which is sort of sell Boeings and do business with Iran. So what I'm merely suggesting is if that we're really serious about changing Iranian behavior, and I'm not sure that the Trump administration is, despite maximum pressure, knowing that the Iranians at any time can call up the Trump administration and say, without any preconditions, we'd like to get into talks with you, and that Trump would probably accept that. But if we're really on the precipice of real change in Iran, what I'm suggesting is help those in Iran who have been dying for a much more singular effort from the United States. I'm not talking about building guerrilla movements in the mountains north of Tehran, right? We're not talking about that. What I'm simply talking about is aiding those who are looking for democratic change in Iran. And I think there are a lot of things that we can do to enhance those efforts. But I say covert action, the knee-jerk reaction is we're getting involved in more long, unwinnable engagements in the Middle East. That's not what I mean.
Okay, David, let's move to you. What's your reaction to Mohsen and Scott's analyses?
Well, I agree with him on quite a few things, but where I differ a bit is just well, at least I don't see eye to eye, certainly with the administration, neither do they, about what we've been doing to undertake support for internal resistance forces inside Iran. And I also cast doubt about the competence and effectiveness of our so-called maximum pressure strategy. The maximum pressure strategy, as it's been designed, comes out of a sort of transactional view of sanctions, that you're going to name and shame and cut off certain institutions and certain actors from the world economy. And through that process, you're going to deprive a government such as Iran of foreign exchange. So foreign exchange has been the sort of bogey that our fighters in the maximum pressure war have focused on. Foreign exchange overtly has declined by well over 50%, maybe as much as 80% in Iran, but they're not running out of money. So the question then, to me, as someone who worked on a country called North Korea, as well as worked twice to help design Iran's pressure strategies previously, are we using the right metrics? We need to understand that as much as 40 to 50% of the Iranian economy is a black economy, okay? And we already heard from Mohsen that they have billions of dollars stashed internally, and I would argue even hundreds of billions of dollars stashed externally. If you're going to try to effectively put a choke on Khamenei, the supreme leader's calculations, and not necessarily change his calculus, because he's not going to change. He's defined his regime, as has his predecessor, and Mohsen is one of the co-founders of the IRGC, can confess this. He's recanted it, but the reality is that their goal was to crush the West, the insolence, the arrogance. That's how they refer to us. We're the arrogance, and we need to be destroyed. By the way, their henchmen, Hezbollah, who are extremely vulnerable and are a very important part of Iran's whole network of influence around the region, around the world, share the exact same ideology. There's zero latitude between them. And some people think we can break one off the other. I've heard all this for years. None of it works. My experience with economic sanctions, which is probably as extensive as almost anyone around, is you got to go for the jugular. When we were successful against North Korea, and I frequently cited this, the inspiration for a lot of these super sanctions, they call them, or sophisticated sanctions, it goes back to this bank in Macau that North Korea controlled called Banco Delta, which we designated under USA Patriot Act in 2005. All that did, for those who don't know about it, we just cut it off from being able to do business with the US. That blew up this little baby bank. But that little baby bank was a funnel where the North Koreans were moving $25 to $50 million a week, every week all year, into their secret bank account networks around the world for Kim Jong-il. We targeted because we were going after Kim Jong-il's money. I have seen no evidence that this administration nor the preceding administrations has made a significant effort to go after Khamenei's personal money or the Quds Force's own money. There's a whole network of trading companies for the IRGC Quds Force that are operating in Iraq, totally unfettered. They're not sanctioned.
Let me just follow up a little bit on the point you just made, because that's very interesting, because unlike what I thought Scott was saying, I want to get back to him on that and see exactly what he's saying, but what I thought Scott was saying, you're saying that within the framework of maximum pressure, as the administration has defined it, they have not actually taken a lot of actions that they could easily justify within the rationale that they have already established.
They're macroeconomists, okay? They're approaching it from a macroeconomic lens, not from a regime-specific, what we would call value-based targeting. When I went after Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, I targeted every single person around him with my military colleagues. We killed them. We killed his finances. We blew up his banks. We created a model of what mattered most to him, including his own support network and friends and family, and we went out and exterminated them, either one way or the other. And that was started under the Obama administration, by the way, and continued under Trump. It was a very different philosophy. It was much more ruthless. When we did Slobodan Milosevic, which I did not play a significant role in, but I did play a little bit of a role in supporting, we did the same thing. We created a whitelist of those who supported him. We supported them. We created a blacklist. We created a whitelist of those who opposed him, and we went and when we gave them support, and then we created a blacklist of those who supported Milosevic, and we destroyed them. And it was us and our European allies. We haven't done anything like this related to the IRGC, the IRGC Quds Force, the Ministry of Intelligence, specifically. What we're focused on is how much foreign exchange they got left, without really understanding that they've got a hell of a lot more foreign exchange stashed around the world than our macroeconomic analysis will indicate, because they're relying on a massive illicit economy to finance their regime, something they've been doing for decades, and specifically in the last 15 years have accelerated. And if you look at what's going on between Venezuela and Iran right now, where they're moving billions of dollars of gold bars out of Venezuela, which are one level being treated as the Venezuelans' payment to the Iranians. My argument is there's been massive cocaine flowing out of Venezuela for years into Europe, including on Iranian aircraft and through land controlled by Hezbollah, most specifically Beirut, Lebanon itself, moving into Europe, and the Iranians are now taking their cut. They're now getting paid. It's not just them getting paid for supporting some oil refinery repairs, which could not have occurred in the short period of time where they just received $5 to $10 billion in gold. And we're misestimating what it's going to take to break the back of this regime, but we're not even aiming to break the back of the regime. Breaking the back of the regime is a very different concept than trying to change their calculus. I don't think their calculus can be changed except through threatening to break their back.
Why? I have two questions to follow up here. One about the gold bars to Iran. That's fascinating. I hadn't heard that analysis before, that it was tied to the illegal drug trade. But before we get to that, why is it, you think, that they have not applied to the regime the same kind of targeted rationale that we applied to ISIS?
Or to Hezbollah previously with law enforcement and special operations? I don't know, except that it just seems that they've got a different model. They're using what's called coercive diplomacy strategy, which is, a lot of books are written in the 80s and 90s about how you could drive up the costs and change the calculations of bad actors and get them to change their behavior. I never have seen this work. I'd like to see a single state in history that can be described as having been truly bent by a, let's put some pressure on them, but let's use like a faucet. We'll turn the faucet up. There'll be a lot of hot water running down their back, or cold water, whichever water you like, and then we'll turn it off, and then they'll change their behavior. I don't buy it.
Now, I know from my own personal experience, when I was in the Bush White House, maybe I could just tell viewers, the first time I met you, I was in charge of Middle East policy in the George W. Bush White House, and I started hearing stories that there was this guy who was getting direct access to the president and briefing him on malign Iranian activities in Iraq. Now, I responded to that like a bureaucrat, which is, why, if I'm in charge of the Middle East of the White House, how come somebody's getting in to talk to the president and I don't know anything about it? So anyway, I called you up, and you were kind enough to come and tell me what you were telling the president. I wasn't alarmed by any of it, so it didn't bother me, even though it rankled my bureaucratic, sensitivities. But what I'm trying to say to those of the viewers is that I know that you have been deep in the bowels on this issue and operating at the highest levels for a long time. So I assume that you have a lot of contacts inside law enforcement, DEA, inside the military. I know you've advised the military for years on these issues. When you talk to people on the operational level, and ask why they're not targeting, why they're not proposing to target Khamenei and the Quds Force and so on, their illicit finances, what do they say to you?
Well, they'll get to it eventually. I mean, it's sort of pathetic because, we had and under Obama even, we had a relatively sophisticated program of action involving law enforcement, particularly the DEA, which is highly feared by the Iranian Quds Force. Let's not forget, and everyone will, because we have many people who don't know around here, Qasem Soleimani, personally, the guy who was the arch terrorist, head of the IRGC Quds Force, who was killed by the U.S. Several months ago. Soleimani had been in charge of the the counter-narcotics police in Kerman in Iran for many years. And we knew, and I say we who were involved in law enforcement and special operations and had close access to senior sources inside the Quds Force and Hezbollah leadership, that Soleimani had been using the narcotics trafficking business to generate income for the operations of his service, which had been involved in killing over 1,000 Americans in Iraq with their Hezbollah cronies while we were fighting in Iraq from 2003 to 2012. They generated a lot of their money through illicit rackets, including drug trafficking. Heroin coming out of Afghanistan. At one stage, we designated one of Soleimani's deputies, General Bahmani, who was the head of Department 4000, the corps of Quds Force officers who controlled Afghanistan affairs, for heroin trafficking. And indeed, they were trafficking heroin, including making its way all the way into the state of New Jersey, through Iraq, and into Europe and into the United States. And we tracked that. And this is the type of sophistication. We were inside their networks. We were following the money from the inside. We had penetrated their money laundering, their money transport networks. And we had very clear evidence, not just intelligence, as to what they were doing, why they were doing it, and what their motives were, because we had direct interactions. When I say we, when I was working with the DEA as part of a special operations task force, we were interacting, and my job as their financial senior advisor was to interact with the leadership of financial institutions around the world that were handling the bank accounts and the personal financial affairs of people like Ayatollah Khomeini. So I had pretty good understanding of what the guy was looking to do with his money and where he was getting his money. And I can tell you 100% certain, it wasn't all coming out of oil exports and pistachios and carpets. There was a dark side to it that was exploitable. And even if it was 10% or 20% of the total, it was an extraordinary vulnerability. And this was briefed to this administration at the beginning of the administration, and they just never have jumped on to it. They have the opportunity to do so still, and I hope they will. Because right now, their policy is not going to succeed at breaking the back of this regime, partly because they don't want to break the back of the regime. If you want to break the back of the regime, you got to go after what's remaining, its remaining source of income, which include illicit narcotics trafficking and money laundering.
So these gold bars from Venezuela that we read about in the newspaper lately. Now, the story I heard is the one that you cast doubt on, that this was a result of this was a payment for Iranian efforts to keep the Venezuelan oil industry solvent. But you're saying that you really think that this is really more a payment for drugs, or in part a payment for drugs? So Hezbollah,
two things. I think Maduro trying to, yeah, please.
How do you understand the transaction there?
I think Maduro, number one, is trying to get his money out of the country. So he's put Tariq al-Husseini, who is his minister of oil and previously his vice president, who's indicted as a drug trafficker and also designated as a kingpin, drug kingpin. So there's no doubt he's involved in drug trafficking. Part of it's Maduro trying to get their money out of the economy. They're looting the central bank. So first and foremost, they're moving their money out. But let's not forget, a lot of their money, in fact, maybe the majority of their money, since oil prices have been falling over the last 24 months, has come from illicit narcotics trafficking. That's something the administration has indicted the Maduro regime about. Who is indicted along with the Maduro regime? Well, Syria, Hezbollah, and Iran. They're all mentioned as cronies and partners, and indeed they are partners. So some of this is probably also Iran trying to claim its share of the proceeds of the narcotics and other illicit oil shipments. So it's not just drugs. The thing about drugs is it's such a huge vulnerability, and it's one of those things that can really allow a foreign government like ours to seize assets. So what we did with Slobodan Milosevic, again, I was just an observer of it, or with even with the Noriega regime, for example, back in Panama in the 80s, we chased their money down around the world. We found their bank accounts. This happened with Christina Kirchner several years ago in Argentina. Many successful civil efforts to change a regime through democracy, not through shooting somebody, okay? And I don't think Scott's advocating that, have come through systematic efforts on behalf of the liberal democratic forces inside a country to reclaim their financial foundations, which have been pilfered, okay? And right now, the Guaido government of Maduro is trying to do that. There are people in Iran that are trying to do that. What's shocking is how little help they're getting from the European government and the United States government. So I'll turn things over to Scott and folks. Sorry.
Actually, let me go back to Mohsen for Scott, and I'll come right back to you. Mohsen, what kind of reactions do you have to what you're hearing? Are you do you think that going after the drug trade would have a significant impact on the dynamics in Iran?
It's well known by many Iranians, that ordinary people, that Revolutionary Guard, especially Quds Force, with the hands of Hezbollah in Lebanon, they are involved in drug trafficking and get money 6 billion to 8 billion, sometimes $10 billion a year from this business and spend it in terrorism. The reaction of the people of Iran, you have heard several times in the demonstrations that they chant that no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, think about Iran and Iran first, or leave Syria and think about the people of Iran, or why should we fight with Israel, with the United States? There are many jokes on these days against the regime in these regards. So, and I can say that what the people demand, it started from 10, 15 years ago to protest to foreign policy of the regime, terrorism, and that Shia crescent, whatever you call it. Not only it was by the people, but recently I have heard it from inside the regime, like the other things. I can say that not only the government of Rouhani, but again, inside Revolutionary Guard, there are big question marks on the policy of the leader of Iran in the region. Mike, what I can say, and I want to say, add to what Scott said, that, first of all, I think that Washington doesn't pay attention enough to change in Iran. Change is on the way. I can compare it to 1978. That was on November 1978, just 3 months before victory of the Islamic Revolution, that the first time in Washington Carter administration, they said, wow, Shah can't control that. The king of Iran is not able to control that, and we should think about the future and the alternatives. First thing I want to say that Washington should understand, I mean, especially the administration, that in Iran, change is on the way. Maybe we will have a failed state in Iran, which is a disaster in that region of the world, or lots of crisis and wearing out of the country, and somehow implosion of the society of Iran. So, I mean, this is the first thing that I think that I, as an Iranian opposition, think that we should talk to administration, Congress, and in think tanks everywhere, in media, that they notice that Iran is going to change. And then if you accept that and watch it carefully, nobody looks for war, as Scott says. And none of the people of Iran is thinking about another JCPOA, because this is something between the government. As the people of Iran say, they say that that's just solve the problem of the Western countries or the powers of the world.
What do people in Iran think about the sanctions? Because we're hearing from a lot of voices in Washington that for reasons of compassion, we should lift the sanctions, and that the United States is alienating the Iranian people through the sanctions and so on. What's your take on those arguments?
These voices in Washington are not the voices of the people of Iran. I have heard from several people in several levels of the society, middle class, lower class, rich people, that they say that, of course, Iranian people are suffered from the sanctions, but they say that if we make sure that these sanctions will finish this regime, and there will be support for democratic movement of people of Iran, we have no problem with that. We can tolerate that. We can tolerate, we can continue hungriness or any pain, but if we make sure that the end of the road, the end of the tunnel is the light of getting, rid of this regime. my last sentence is that, you know, there is a zone between war or, you know, signing some contracts with this regime. That's helping the people of Iran, democratic movement of the people of Iran. Let me give you an example. And these days, truck drivers in Iran are under pressure very much. They already had some strikes, and of course, they can't have their own syndicate or trade union. The regime doesn't let them, but under the cover, you know, underground, they have their own organization. I have some contact with them. They say that we can stop all the trucks in Iran and you know, stop the country. About 200,000 trucks running all around the country. But they say that we are afraid that what next? If this regime goes, we are afraid of a failed state and, you know, taking apart the country. If we make sure that international community, especially the United States, when the people of Iran say international community, they mean United States more than any other country, support us and will help us to take over the country, then we are ready to go for that. Not only, this is just an example. You can see such a demand from, for instance, members of even Revolutionary Guard, some of them, or the other parts of the society. For instance, in this coronavirus, many of the doctors, we signed a letter together with the doctors in Iran, more than 1,000 of them, and the nurses. They said that we need the support of international community. This regime can't manage this crisis. I mean, I know that U.S. tried to help the people of Iran and regime banned that, but still there are good ways to send the supplies to help the people through the non-governmental organizations and the private hospitals and people. I mean, people of Iran are now, you know, Iran is in a way, in a situation that needs help. Democratic opposition of Iran needs help by covert operation or sometimes publicly, and show the people that U.S. can help them and will help them, especially that it's very common amongst Iranians that believe that this regime is dependent to Russia. And as you know, we have a historical conflict with Russians more than any other country in the world, because they humiliated Iranians during the last 200 years, and they're not satisfied with that.
So on that note, pardon me. Let's bring Scott back in. He's been sitting there quietly. We've been talking about him, but let's give him an opportunity to say something. But Scott, when I hear the words covert operations, I have a number of fears, and one of them is, can we be sure, if we were to follow Mohsen's advice and what I think was your advice, that, say, the Chinese wouldn't step in to prop up the regime, the Russians? I mean, President Obama predicted several times that the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria was simply going to fall, and the regime situation deteriorated greatly, and then the Russians moved in to prop it up. They were not just going to sit back idly and watch as the United States takes out one of its allies. So I agree with Mohsen that change is coming. There's no doubt that change is coming. But if we're seen to move in with covert action and in an effort to radically change the politics there, can we be sure that the Russians and the Chinese are just going to sit on the sidelines?
Mike, let me take a step back. Before, I think what Mohsen is saying, and Mohsen, please correct me if I'm wrong, change is coming, change is upon us. We're seeing a regime that's more discredited than it has been in 4 decades. We all agree with that. But like Dave, I'm not convinced yet that the key pillars of support within this regime, the Atesh, the IRGC, the law enforcement forces, that they are ready to abandon the regime in favor of a transition. I'm not saying that we're not in a place that's interesting to start examining ways of weakening those pillars of support, and I can get into that, and that's what I'm kind of proposing here, but I'm not seeing a regime that is on the verge of collapsing. So for me, going back to Dave's point, I think this maximum pressure strategy has been, let's call it what it is, misdirected. And the regime can take more pressure. They're going to continue to sustain more pressure. They know that, again, the Trump administration is not serious about regime change. But my question is why? If Iran is arguably much more of a threat to the United States than Venezuela is, why don't we have a regime change policy in Iran? One, like I said, that is more moderate. We're spending well over $30 to $40 million every year on Voice of America and Radio Farda and regular broadcasts that it's just the same reel over and over of telling the same disaffected stories about how bad the regime is. It needs to, when I say covert action, I'm not talking about a military invasion or aiding that. What I'm simply saying is a better use of money that can actually push Iran to a place where you're actually going to stand a chance of change. Now, getting to your point, well, why wouldn't the Russians simply just come in and push against us? I would defer to Mohsen on that, but I think that the vast majority of Iranians, including a number of conservatives and people who've been in the establishment for this entire 40-year period, don't really like the Russians. And I don't think they trust the Russians. And I think that the Russian commitment to Iran has been oversold. I think that it's very opportunistic and transactional. And I think there's deep distrust that lies at the relationship between the Russians and the Iranians. So again, I see a real opportunity. It's not, there's no magic easy covert action 2.0 solution here. But again, if we want to start spending money and time to really affect change, as in the interest of reaching goals that as we've defined them, okay, changing Iranian behavior, that's what I'm merely suggesting.
Let me imagine you're in the proverbial, you can give the proverbial elevator pitch to President Trump, and you've got, you've got 2 minutes to tell him the specific things that you would like to see him do that he's not doing. Scott, what would those 2 things be?
Well, the first thing I would do is say, you need to stop talking about how you're willing to meet with the Iranians with no preconditions whatsoever. That undermines everything about his so-called maximum pressure strategy. That alone totally hollows out any idea that he's serious about putting pressure on the regime. He's got to stop doing that. Second,
okay, I gotta make you say 3, because my view is that Donald Trump regards the negotiations as part of his brand. If you give him that advice, he's going to say, get off the elevator. So I give you 2 more now.
Well, Mike, I would say, listen, I mean, it's a pointless conversation to have, because I get Donald Trump's end game here is not to do anything in terms of affecting regime change in Iran. He wants to do a deal, and there's no convincing him otherwise, and that's been clearly obvious. I don't think there's anything you could say to him in an elevator speech or an hour-long speech that would convince him to change course.
Oh, no. I don't see it that way at all. I think that that he wants to be seen before the American public as willing to negotiate. It's part of his brand to be open to negotiations. But we see from the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the maximum pressure campaign that we have, which is quite significant. I mean, he's getting a lot of criticism from the left for what he's doing. So you want to refine it. And so what would be your recommendations to, if he had a willingness to be to turn the screws and be more aggressive, or say you're talking to Mike Pompeo, who's known to be the most prominent advocate of maximum pressure, how would you want to refine it?
Well, the first thing you have to do is look at where we spend the most money right now is on media operations. It's on press. First thing you have to do is actually take that from a regular news media to an action-oriented media operation. The only way that you're going to galvanize the Iranians to do what Mohsen wants them to do and really get in and start acting instead of talking and accepting that the US isn't really doing much, it isn't going to help us change, is to show that we are serious about trying to put out information that's going to help them take the steps that they need to take. So Mohsen mentioned a number of Ministry of Intelligence reports that go into very detail about the grave concerns about the regime. Why don't we start declassifying information? Why don't we start putting out sensitive information that actually lets Iranians know, my goodness, the regime really is a lot more brutal than we thought. We need to have, that you need to lower the threshold for mass participation, giving them a sense of confidence about the real realities as spoken to them by Iranians themselves, the most sensitive supporters of the revolution in the Ministry of Intelligence and the IRGC, that nothing could be more compelling to get them to action. So it's a different form of getting information into the hands of the international community, and particularly of Iranians on the ground who need to know that, one, we're behind them. Two, the Iranians, by their own accord, whether it's coronavirus mishandling or fears of being overrun. And if you look at the 2017-18 protests, Ministry of Intelligence, their own internal reporting to the Supreme Leader was very clear. They said, sir, if we reached the threshold of our resistance. If we had 1,500 people protesting in 200 cities, okay, which was about 30% more than what they had, we wouldn't have been able to handle it. So Iranians need to know that. Right now, they don't have a sense of how close they are. They don't have a sense of, is it really worth me to take the risk? They're not going to get involved in an armed resistance movement, but you need to get more people out on the streets to actually think about what they can do.
So show the vulnerabilities of the regime. Number two, show that the United States is supportive of democratic change. And it seems to me that what would be missing in all of this is an understanding on the part of Iranians on the street or within the regime who are disaffected of the organization that they would be joining in order to put pressure. I mean, what's really missing in Iranian opposition politics, I think, is an obvious leadership. Could a media campaign help with that?
I think it could, and I think if you look at the Green Movement, 2002, 2009, 2010, you had Mousavi and Karabi and others. They were foisted upon the Iranian people as the leaders of a transition that was going to lead them out of the current theocracy to something else. That's not what they wanted. They never advocated that. You need to identify a leader, and you do a lot of things, quite frankly, that the Trump administration is doing right now with Venezuela. We have an overt regime change policy in Venezuela. You're starting to organize parallel institutions, social, economic, and political institutions. You're talking about the way forward. You're talking about planning for elections, electoral bodies, monitoring. You're talking about pulling away military supporters. All of this is action-oriented pressure, far short of military intervention by the United States, to affect political change in Venezuela. Again,
okay, so I'm putting you back in the elevator with Donald Trump.
Okay.
And Donald Trump is going to let down the mask for a minute, and he's going to tell you some of his real calculations. And he's going to say, Scott, I'm running for president in November on a peace and prosperity platform. And I've got a significant segment of my base. Forget about Bernie Sanders and the Democrats. I got a significant segment of my base, the Rand Paul, Tucker Carlson, restraintist base of the Republican Party. And the minute they hear me talking about regime change, I am going to come under such pressure. And I can't possibly talk about these things. But, Scott, I agree with you to a certain extent. I agree with you that in order to get them to the table the way I want to get them, to have real behavior change, I got to put more pressure on them. So what are the steps I can take that will allow me to look the Rand Paul supporters and the Tucker Carlson wing of the party in the face and honestly say, I'm not going for a regime change, but I'm really upping the pressure. Are there any activities within that band that you can think of?
I think so. I think people like Rand Paul are certainly going to be shriek in horror if you're talking about covert action and regime change, obviously. But But there are so many areas of human rights that we can do more on, can increase sanctions. And to Dave's point, what about transnational organized crime? Nobody is going to be opposed to the idea of looking at the Drug Kingpin Act, which we've used against the Iranians all too infrequently, unfortunately, and expanding that use. The Iranians have a deep problem with narcotics addiction. Every Iranian family in the country has an issue with this. Pushing to do more on counter narcotics that is linked directly to the IRGC and others, nobody on either on the right or the left is going to have a problem with that. And that's something that's very incriminating and would be easy to push forward.
Okay, David, then let's go back to you. You're in the elevator with Donald Trump. You've already heard Scott make his pitch, and Scott is ended with counter narcotics. What would you add on the 2 or 3 points, the things that we can do quickest that would have the maximum impact?
We need a policy of comprehensive containment with selective high-level engagement. But the engagement should not be designed to undermine the containment. The containment is the policy. The containment will include covert action to enhance the effectiveness of containment. It will include political warfare or hybrid warfare type activities, which have nothing to do with warfare. They are information warfare, it's cyber operations, it's things we're trying to do to interfere with the financial integrity of the leadership's finances offshore. So, we're talking, how do I go after the kleptocracy of Khamenei while still letting the people survive and not starve to death? I think there's lots of ways to do this. We don't have a targeted effort against the leadership as much as we got a effective policy to drain down their foreign exchange, which affects everybody. It does affect the leadership, but they're the last ones who are going to run out of foreign exchange, I can assure you. Narcotics trafficking is important, but the most important tool is law enforcement strategy against the IRGC and Hezbollah for terrorism. They've killed over 1,600 Americans roughly in their history, starting in 1982 and 1983 with the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut twice, 241 Marines being murdered in 1983 by Hezbollah and the Iranians, and continuing all the way to the 1,000 plus Americans who lost their lives at the hands of Iran and Hezbollah operations in Iraq. But I'm saying, Mr. Trump, don't forget about 1,000 Americans that died under the Obama administration, whose lives were destroyed and whose families' lives and livelihoods have been destroyed by a bunch of Iranian thugs that you think are a sort of transcendental problem that can be negotiated away. These people were willing to kill American soldiers on the ground outside of their own country, okay? They're willing to kill Americans in New York City and Boston and Washington, D.C. if it comes to it. The Iranian Revolution has not been stopped. It's not been snuffed out. I don't think it's been scarcely affected by the sanctions policy of your administration. You have boxed them in. You have hurt their ability to engage in large-scale economic hegemony type activities across the region, but you have not stopped their regular warfare efforts whatsoever. And in fact, you probably enhanced their resolve to keep fighting with their partners against us.
So with regard to Hezbollah, what are the specific actions you'd like to see the Trump administration take, within the next?
Hezbollah's Islamic Jihad organization terrorist unit, the unit that runs their military operations and terrorist operations, should be indicted as a terrorist organization by the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice has never indicted a transnational terrorist organization in its entire history, even though Hezbollah was the first significant terrorist organization to ever attack the United States and our interests abroad. They're still totally left without any sort of assignation of blame or cost for killing thousands of Americans with their Iranian partners over the years, as well as hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of innocent Iranians, including abroad.
In terms of changing the balance of power between the U.S. and Iran, between the U.S. and Hezbollah, and increasing the effectiveness of the maximum pressure campaign, how would a DOJ indictment change the game?
Well, the thing about tools like the Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organization Act, which has been used against the mob extensively. It allows asset forfeiture to be engaged in all over the world, including in many states that normally protect assets of private bank account holders, such as Switzerland or Austria or Liechtenstein or Lithuania or many other countries, historically Panama. In the context of pursuing mob finances, we've normally gotten a level of cooperation that's been higher than standard. Our policy right now toward Iran is sanctions. It's not taking their money away. It's not forfeiture. Okay, you can't do forfeiture with sanctions. I find it when you take people's money away based on legal reasons, like narcotics trafficking or kleptocracy, or just overt, theft involving, partnership with foreign terrorist organizations and foreign governments, that there's a lot of support around the world for those sorts of efforts to reclaim those assets on behalf of the people of the country that's affected. We haven't undertaken any sort of effort that I'm aware of that's systematically involved to do that. Where we did do it against Saddam Hussein, ironically, after we had invaded, we found billions of dollars around the Middle East, brought them back to Iraq, at least gave the Iraqi government, after we'd invaded, something to work on that wasn't US money. It's not enough to say I don't support that. I mean, I don't support invading. I support strategically pressuring these regimes and containing their worst aspects, and putting them into a position where they're either going to change their fundamental direction. And this isn't about a choice in negotiation. This is about, should Iran be run by a revolutionary guard or by the democratically elected state of Iran? Should it be run by the people of Iran? My view is the people should rule Iran, not the mullahs. I don't think that's incompatible with Donald Trump's worldview. That doesn't mean we cause a war to do it. I think the people of Iran, if we give them support and we cut off the Iranian regime's illicit avenues for support, are more than capable of taking care of a change of their state and society for the better.
Fascinating. Okay, let's bring this to an end, but let me give each one of you a chance for final comments and reactions to the others, if you have any. And we'll start with you, Mohsen.
No, I agree with what Scott and David said, and I just want to emphasize that we need to talk to officials in the US. I mean, when I say we, I mean, for instance, I'm one of the founders of Iran Transition Council, which is a wide spectrum of opposition inside and outside Iran. We have royalists, we have ethnic groups, we have the leftist, rightist in a transition council. We tried to talk, for instance, to German government. Easily, we had meetings with them. But in Washington, I tried to talk, for instance, to Mr. Brian Hook, who is in charge. At last, I didn't succeed. And they were not ready even to hear that. We wanted just to, for instance, we had a similar meeting with the Netherlands government and explained for them that change is coming, and they really appreciated that. We just wanted to tell to the officials, especially Mr. Hook is somebody who is in charge of Iran on these days. He even didn't give us any time to talk on Corona times that we could have internet talking. I mean, I want to emphasize that first step, we have opposition mobilized together, but we need this opposition that I'm a member of, that we don't have opportunity to say to the officials in the US that look again at Iran. Iran is going on a way that needs to pay attention. And second, I want to emphasize on media. Actually, money is going somewhere which is useless. I
You mean
know everybody has
American
talked
money?
about that, but
You're criticizing
result for that
American media
so far.
operations? Sorry.
No, I'm talking especially about Voice of America, because ordinary Iranians think that Voice of America is actually a window to the American policy. But if you look at Voice of America, there's nothing in that, nothing. I have the good experience with Voice of America during Green Movement 2009. I was in a weekly show, although there were lots of restrictions, but that weekly show had 20 million audience in Iran, and many of the slogans of the people who were produced in Iran, they told me, and when I somehow said that in next demonstration, for instance, death to Russia will be the slogan of the people, then millions of people shouted that on the streets. I mean, these media that US pays for them, taxpayers pay for them, can act much better than that, especially in this time. And none of them is like Voice of America. Voice of America is important because people think that this is actually the voice of the policy of the United States. But if you look at it, first of all, nobody looks at that. Less than 6% of the Iranians pay attention to that TV. And the second, there is nothing in that.
Okay, Scott, do you have some final comments for us?
It's an extraordinary time, Mike, for the reasons Mohsen's pointed out. Internally, I think that's where our focus has to be. I think there are a lot of things that, along the lines of what David's suggesting, in improving the ability to go after illicit finances, focusing more on transnational organized crime, enhancing existing sanctions. There's no doubt that the sanctions regime of the maximum pressure has been strong, and it's constricted oil revenues, and it's going to start working on non-oil revenues. All of that is important, but in my opinion, external pressure only, sanctions only, in other words, is not going to be nearly enough to move closer toward a political transition. So you're talking about, as you mentioned, we need to restore faith in the political opposition as a viable and reliable political alternative to the existing government. I think it comes and it goes, but nobody knows who to unify behind. You've got teachers movements, you've got students, you've got labor unions, you've got all these disparate protest movements that need to be knit together into one cohesive national opposition movement, nonviolent. And somebody needs to help that along, and there needs to be leaders and a face to that, and it needs to have US backing. That's the type of thing that I think is going to get real momentum. Until we actually force regime elites, and particularly security services, to start thinking about shifting their loyalties, and the best way to do that is through mass participation, I think an entirely external focused strategy, which is what we've done until now, sanctions, 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 is bound to fail.
Thanks. And David, your thoughts?
Ronald Reagan had a very clear concept against the Soviet Union beginning in the 1970s, well before he was elected president of the United States. He saw the Soviet Union as truly an evil empire. He saw communism as equivalent to the devil incarnate. He saw it as a means of instability and an existential threat to peace and prosperity in the world. But at the same time, he engaged with the Soviet leadership repeatedly in arms control. He wasn't afraid to talk to them, but it was peace through strength, as Reagan famously stated in a number of speeches. It wasn't strong sanctions to get to negotiations where we achieve essentially tactical negotiating objectives. Just getting the Iranians back to the table isn't difficult. Getting the Iranians to start to think differently about what the table means is a very more challenging concept. Iran does not accept the reality of Western liberal capitalism, freedom, and democracy. Okay, they just don't do that. And not the Iranian people, but the IRGC. I see the IRGC as not so different than the Soviet Union. I don't think the IRGC, especially in league with the government of China, which is the communist government of China, the communist government in many aspects still of Russia, even though the Soviet Union may be long gone. these regimes represent the antithesis of what our state and society are defined about, and will continue to be, should we want to maintain peace and prosperity and for our future, and not lock ourselves down over coronavirus and fear of potential conflict in the world. If we exhibit peace through strength, we will have peace. If we exhibit a peace through trying to duck and cover and hide ourselves from the world system, we will most likely have war. And I believe that given what Iran, North Korea, and Communist China represent in terms of potential higher stage nuclear weapons and asymmetrical missile cooperation in the coming decade, I think that war could well be a nuclear war. So on that bright and cheery note, there's a lot at stake here. It's not just about a negotiating strategy. It's about a strategy toward regimes which have our end as a free state society as their goal. Thank you.
Okay, on that, as you say, bright and cheery note, let me thank all of you. It's been a very interesting and productive conversation, and I hope we can reconvene after the coronavirus to reassess the situation. So without any further ado, I'll bring this meeting to a close, and once again, thank you.